I welcome everyone to the 21st meeting of the Education and Skills Committee, and please remind everyone to turn mobile phones and other devices to silent for the duration of the meeting. Our first item of business is to decide whether to take item 3 in private, which is a discussion between members of the evidence taken today. We intend to do so? Thank you. Agenda item 2, we welcome to committee this morning the Cabinet Secretary for Education Skills, John Swinney MSP, is here to discuss some themes of interest to the committee: return to school, additional support needs, exam diet and counselling and wellbeing. And we will try to take the questions in that order this morning. Can I remind members and the Cabinet Secretary that there is a slight delay between audio and video for those attending remotely, and would ask everybody to leave a short pause to ensure broadcasting colleagues can activate correct microphones. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement this morning?
Good morning, Convener and members of the committee. The reopening of schools and early learning and childcare settings has been a central priority for the Scottish Government. I'm delighted that overall the feedback from schools and local authorities has been positive since the start of term. Our job now is to do all that we can to take account of the evolving situation and respond accordingly to ensure schools remain safe environments for all pupils and staff. Working with the Education Recovery Group, we will continue to update our guidance as required, as we did recently with face coverings, and to ensure that the best support is in place for children, young people and staff. We are acutely aware of the impact that the pandemic has had on our children and young people, and are conscious that it will continue to impact for some time. We have already published guidance to support schools to consider the wellbeing needs of children and young people, and our Mental Health in Schools working group, established prior to COVID-19, is now developing a new professional learning resource. We also know that for some children and young people who have had negative experiences during lockdown, it may take some time for these matters to come to light. Our guidance recognises that and highlights the need for a sustained focus over time on these issues. In addition, the child and adolescent mental health services continue, with emergency and urgent cases being prioritised. There has been significant progress in the provision of counselling through schools, and authorities in schools have a wide range of whole school and targeted approaches in place. We are mindful of the impact on children and young people with additional support needs. In June, we published the review of additional support for learning chaired by Angela Morgan, which found that the fundamental policies and principles in place at present create a solid framework to support our children and young people. There were suggested areas for improvement which we will give full and careful consideration to, and are working in partnership with the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities and the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland to agree actions to address the findings and recommendations. A full response will be published in the autumn of 2020. I'm also mindful of the importance of the wellbeing of school staff. This is crucial as they support our children and young people to recover from the pandemic. Earlier this week, I was pleased to confirm an additional package of support which focuses on staff wellbeing, new professional learning for post-probation teachers, a new coaching and mentoring offer, and further funding for values-based leadership through Columba 1400. This will complement the excellent practice which is already taking place to support the wellbeing of staff in schools across Scotland. As set out in the programme for government, an equity audit has been established. It has begun examining the impact of the school closures on children and young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. We will publish the key findings from this by the end of the year, including evidence from a range of national and international literature, as well as from schools themselves. It will include a dedicated focus on the voice and experiences of children and young people. Alongside this, Education Scotland, in partnership with schools and local authorities, will also be gathering local evidence that focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on learning experiences, attainment and health and wellbeing, as well as the support that has been put in place to facilitate recovery. I'm keenly aware that the sector wants clarity with regards to how national qualifications in 2021 will be assessed. The very real risk remains that there may be further disruptions for individual learners, individual schools and colleges, or more widely across the country during the course of the year. and there is no way of knowing what circumstances we will face in the spring of next year when, in normal circumstances, the exam diet would take place. That uncertainty and risk of further disruption makes identifying a fair and robust approach an incredibly difficult decision, and there are a wide range of views on the best approach to take. Our ambition remains to run a 2021 examination diet. However, in these exceptional times, the SQA and the Education Recovery are looking at contingencies which will be appropriate to the circumstances. This is especially relevant as we are currently seeing a disturbing increase in the number of cases of coronavirus, which has the potential to cause further disruption. It is also imperative that we consider fully the lessons of the 2020 national qualifications. Professor Priestley will report the findings of his independent review soon, which will include recommendations for assessment this year, and will be important in my consideration of the dilemma that we are facing. The Scottish Qualifications Authority has consulted on measures to modify course assessment for national qualifications this year and the timetabling of exams. Whilst I understand the need to share this with the system as soon as possible, I believe that any such changes need to be considered alongside the findings of the Priestley review. I want to provide as much certainty as possible in this time of great uncertainty, and I have therefore asked the Chief Examiner to pause on publishing her report while I await the outcome of Professor Priestley's review. I've done so in order that the system can receive as much clarity and certainty as possible on a range of related issues, and this will be set out at the start of October. And I'm happy to address questions from members of the committee.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And we'll move to questions on theme 1, which is return to school, and invite Jamie Halker-Johnson to be followed by Alec Neil.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. A couple of questions around issues that I've raised before. You assured us that all devices, laptops, access to broadband would be with local authorities by, I think it was the 21st of August. Can you confirm that that target, which had moved repeatedly over the summer, had been met? And also advise what plans are for the remaining 21 million of the initial funding that was provided and whether that's been allocated or there are plans to allocate it going forward.
On the first point from Mr. Halker-Johnson, I can confirm that the devices that we said would be distributed to local authorities were distributed to local authorities in the timescale that was set out. In relation to the remaining resources, a distribution agreement of those resources has been reached with individual local authorities, and it will be for individual local authorities to determine how most appropriately to utilise the funding that's available to them to meet the requirements of the programme, which is to tackle the issues of digital disadvantage that affect young people in our communities.
Thank you for that answer. No one wants to see a situation where schools are forced to close again, but there are rising cases and there is concerns that may well be the case. It's vital that preparations are in place for that eventuality. So are you confident that every local authority and every school has a plan in place to ensure that they are able to deal with a situation where they may be forced to close, and also that they have the resources in place and those individual pupils have resources in place to make sure that no one's excluded from those plans?
The first point I'd make here is that I think it's important at the outset, despite the fact that we are seeing a rising number of cases of coronavirus in the community, to recognise that all schools in Scotland are today open, and that's a very significant achievement and has essentially been the position since the 11th of August. And that's a major achievement for the education system to have been able to deliver that. The second point is that fundamentally schools have the responsibility for the delivery of learning to individual young people, and they should be taking steps to make sure that the practices and priorities are in place to do that. And of course, a lot of good work was undertaken in the spring as schools prepared for what we thought was going to be the likely eventuality of a resumption of schooling in August on a blended learning model, which would be see pupils in school part of the time and learning at home part of the time. That schools were essentially preparing for such scenarios. And so that work that was undertaken in the spring was good work undertaken by schools and of value should we face the situation where either individuals or classes or year cohorts or in worst case scenarios schools are unable to be open because of coronavirus, which as I stated in the earlier part of my answer, thankfully is a situation we are not in at the present moment. So schools will be undertaking all of that activity to ensure that is the case. But there are also additional elements that complement that work, principally through the work that is undertaken through eSchool, which is a digital learning platform, which is a collaboration across the education system in Scotland. And I'm very pleased with the substantial progress that was made over the summer in creating a strong, available digital platform that can be utilised by individual pupils or classes or schools should they face disruption to learning during the course of the school year. A combination of those local measures and the national proposition that's in place, I think, provides significant reassurance on this question. And lastly, I think it's important to focus on the earlier question that Mr. Halker-Johnson raised, which is that we have put new resources into the system to enable the acquisition of devices to ensure that those young people who don't have access to digital connectivity, whether it's a device or a connectivity package, because the resources that we've put in place envisage the possibility of devices and or connectivity packages being put in place to enable young people to be able to access learning in such circumstances.
Okay, can we move to Mr. Neil to be followed by Mr. Johnson? Alec Neil, please.
Testing regime.
Mr. Neil, sorry, could you repeat the start? We missed you just at the very start of that. Sorry, could you start from the beginning?
Right. Good morning. Can I ask John specifically about the testing regime? We've seen down south the shambolic nature of test and trace and the impact on schooling and indeed in wider society with a huge backlog and so on. So can you update us on what the situation we face in Scotland and in particular where we're at in terms of testing and tracing in relation to the schools and the wider education system, what impact any delays are having, if there are any delays, and will we be in a position, particularly as we're relying to a degree on the UK system, can we guarantee that we won't be put to the back of the queue by the UK if the crisis down south of the border continues, so that our schools, our staff are not going to be denied tests because of the crisis south of the border?
In relation to the situation affecting young people of school age, for example, in the first week of the schools returning, in the week beginning the 10th of August, 2,500 pupils, young people of school age, were tested for coronavirus. In the third week of the schools returning, 25,000 young people of school age were tested, which was a measure of the, I think, increased concern amongst parents where young people were displaying symptoms which might have been construed as COVID symptoms, but I think were more commonly associated with the type of bugs that circulate when schools return and with which we're all very familiar. I think it's important to recognise that although 2,500 tests were done in week 1 and 25,000 tests were done in week 3, there was no discernible difference in the number of positive cases that were identified. They were broadly of the same order, of between 30 and 40 cases out of, in week 1, 2,500, in week 3, 25,000. So I use that data to reassure Mr Neil that there was a very significant amount of testing undertaken of young people who were presented for testing by their parents during that period. Now, we've seen a significant reduction in that demand from young people of school age in the intervening period, which has obviously led to less demand on our testing arrangements. So I hope that detail reassures Mr Neil that there has been, in fact, adequate capacity available to undertake the type of testing that Mr Neil would believe to be appropriate. Now, that brings me on to the wider question of the testing arrangements, and as the committee will be familiar, the arrangements that are taken forward are essentially undertaken under the auspices of a UK-wide scheme through the system of Lighthouse laboratory arrangements which are in place. Now, the First Minister made clear in her press briefing on Monday the importance we attach to making sure there is fair, appropriate and equitable access to that testing capacity for tests that have to be undertaken within Scotland. And those issues are the subject of ongoing dialogue with UK ministers, and indeed the First Minister spoke directly with the Secretary of State for Health on Monday evening on that question. And obviously the Scottish Government attaches the highest importance to ensuring that the concerns expressed by Mr Neil on this question are fully and properly addressed by the testing arrangements that are in place. There is, of course, a range of measures undertaken or being undertaken to continue to expand testing capacity, because we realise that we will need more testing capacity as each week goes by into winter. And there will be expansion of walk-in test centres, for example, and there are centres to be available fundamentally in the areas of particularly intense student population over the course of the next few weeks, and there will be wider expansion of testing capacity. And the final point I would make, of course, we have in place the protocol which enables members of staff in schools who are concerned about their health and well-being, that they can secure, although they may not be displaying symptoms of coronavirus, they can secure a test for coronavirus through the employment portal. And that option is available to members of staff to assist us in sustaining staff numbers within our schools.
Okay. Mr Neil?
That's very helpful indeed. That's very helpful indeed as a good update. Can I ask a further two supplementaries on this? First of all, the expansion programme, which is very welcome, given that we're going into the winter, is that under the control of the Scottish Government and not reliant on the decisions or whims of the UK Government, who, were prepared to sacrifice Scotland for higher priorities as they saw it elsewhere in the UK? And we don't want to be in that position, obviously, if we can avoid it. And secondly, can the Deputy First Minister give us an update on the current staffing position? How badly or well are we doing in terms of staffing situation in the schools in relation to COVID?
On the first point, in terms of the expansion of capacity, there will be, I suppose the best way to answer that question is to say that we are working on a mixed economy set of proposals. There is an expansion of testing capacity that is part of the UK-wide programme, in which the Scottish Government is heavily invested, and we will be cooperating with the UK Government to ensure that the commitments that have been made are fulfilled. And that is really the substance of the dialogue that is being undertaken by the First Minister directly with UK ministers in this respect. But then there will also be, we will be looking at any possible ways in which through, for example, our own National Health Service infrastructure, we can expand testing capacity to maximise the capacity that's available, because I think we all accept, and I totally accept, the fundamental point in Mr Neil's question, that we must maximise testing capacity in the run-up to winter, as it is so critical to the management of outbreaks, to taking decisions about self-isolation and to minimising the spread of the virus within the community. On the second point in relation to staffing, on the most recent data that's available to me, I would say that we are looking at about perhaps 2% of staff currently being absent due to issues in relation to COVID, mostly in relation to the requirements to self-isolate. But obviously that's a figure that fluctuates on a daily basis. But it's of that order. Now, we're obviously taking a number of measures to support staff in that respect. We're also engaging with, schools will be engaging with staff, because although staff may be self-isolating, they can continue to contribute towards the education of young people through the digital the approaches that were the subject of my answers to Mr Halcrow-Johnson a moment ago. And obviously the well-being of staff and pupils is fundamental to us, so we are undertaking further surveillance work led by Public Health Scotland to provide us with information on any issues and experiences of COVID across the school estate and the school population, to make sure that we can act accordingly to provide reassurance and to assist any affected individuals.
Thank you. Can we move to Mr Johnson to be followed by Mr Green?
I know the Cabinet Secretary will agree with me that the resumption of full-time education goes beyond simply reopening our school buildings and getting children inside them. And indeed, I've raised the issues facing the outdoor education sector with him before. There's now a petition with over 4,000 signatures, and the issues faced by the sector are very real. Indeed, the Chief Executive of Scottish Outdoor Education Centres says that simply if there's no change, they are facing a cliff edge in March. And the issues are essentially twofold. One, the guidance not permitting trips and residential experiences. And secondly, a kind of more imminent financial issue. The organisations in question having not qualified for funds such as the Third Sector Resilience Fund. So I was just wondering what discussions and dialogue the Cabinet Secretary and the Scottish Government are having, and what proposals they're bringing forward so we don't see a catastrophic loss of this provision in Scottish education.
Kavir, there's 2 points that I would make in relation to this question. The first is that we acknowledge the importance of outdoor learning and outdoor education for children and young people in terms of their educational and individual development. And for many, many years, that has been an integral part of Scottish education. And indeed, there have been many strong examples of how pupil equity funding, for example, has been utilised by schools for this purpose, to strengthen the resilience and the individual development of young people. So we in no way dispute the importance of outdoor education and outdoor learning. But we have to observe the public health advice that is available to us, and the public health advice is essentially does not currently permit and provide for the safe resumption of residential outdoor education in the fashion to which we have been accustomed. And I'm sure Mr Johnson will understand how ministers have to respect the advice that we are receiving on that particular point. In relation to the assistance, and obviously, as I stressed in my opening statement, we will continue to keep all of these issues under review, and if there is any opportunity for us to consider any amended guidance that comes to us from the expert advisory group that provides us with very specific advice on school education and the education of young people, we will of course reflect on that in the period going forward. And the second point I would raise is really in relation to the support that's available to outdoor education centres. The government has funded a programme of advice and assistance to enable outdoor education providers to adapt to the difficult circumstances that they face. There are, of course, other funding streams that are available, some of which Mr. Johnson has already cited. And of course, many organisations will have applied and utilised the support that's available through the furlough scheme. And I think this is a very good example of why it would be beneficial for the furlough scheme to be continued for a sustained period, given the challenges that the outdoor education sector faces.
Can I suggest the Cabinet Secretary discusses those funding schemes directly with the organisations, because they claim they haven't been able to access those funds. But just taking up the point of the guidance and the scientific advice, with regard to other forms of extracurricular activity, again, there seems to be, I think, an inconsistency. So if we look at football, for example, the SFA have guidance permitting them to resume football training for young people wishing to undertake football training with them. However, the officials at City of Edinburgh Council tell me that they are unable to resume football training within a school context because of a prohibition on contact sport and indeed issues around the guidance of people from outside the school coming in. So we have a slightly frustrating situation whereby young people can undertake football training as long as it's not done in connection with the school, but in terms of resuming training with their school teams, they can't do that. Is that something that the Scottish Government could review and look at, because obviously that's an unsatisfactory situation for those young people?
I'm very happy to explore the issues that that Mr. Johnson raises if he wishes to write to me with further details on the advice that he's referring to from the City of Edinburgh Council. I'm very happy to consider that. The current arrangements permit the resumption of organised contact sports. And obviously, it's important that if there's any misunderstanding of those arrangements or those provisions, that we properly address them, because we want to make sure that as far as possible, we are opening up the opportunities for young people to be physically active and physically active in an organised set of arrangements. And if there are any impediments to enable that to be the case, then obviously we need to look at that. And I completely understand the frustration that exists about, for example, indoor physical education within schools, and the guidance does not currently permit indoor PE, and there are there's an articulated rationale for that within the guidance. But again, that is something that we keep under review. But if there are any particular examples where members, particularly Mr. Johnson, does not believe that the sentiments of the guidance are being properly followed or require some further clarification, then I'm very happy to explore any of those circumstances.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mr. Green, followed by Ms. Wishart?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Clearly, as you've just confirmed at the moment, there are a number of school staff who are off because of the coronavirus. I think you said 2.5%. My understanding is that there are a couple of hundred of teachers at any given time potentially off. Given that we're going into the winter season, that number may rise. We hope it doesn't, but there is the possibility and perhaps an inevitability that as we progress and cases rise as teachers are off. The downside of that clearly is that if a teacher is not there to teach a class, then pupils are unable to learn in that scenario. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, did we go into this pandemic with enough teachers in the first place? Because clearly there is a knock-on effect of teacher absences against our ability to provide the education our children need.
Convener, we went into the pandemic with teacher numbers at the highest level since 2010, and with the number of primary teachers at their highest level since 1980. So I think the teaching population was very strong as we went into the COVID pandemic. I've obviously announced, secondly, additional funding to recruit more teachers, and the data that I have, the most recent data I have available, is that an additional 1,118 teachers have been recruited by local authorities, and there are ongoing discussions between local authorities and individual candidates in another 250 cases, which will bring the number in total to just a little short of 1,400 on the current plans. But obviously, local authorities are continuing to review their staffing requirements and their plans. The third aspect of this is that we have already authorised the General Teaching Council to work with directors of education on the identification of members of the General Teaching Council register who are qualified teachers but who are not currently teaching, to identify currently registered teachers who are not currently registered, to identify if they would be available to contribute towards teaching should there be challenges over the period ahead. And from my recollection, I think the number involved in that is in excess of 2,000 to 2,500. And the final point I would make is that whilst we have teachers who are not able to be in school for self-isolation, many of them will be very well and very healthy and able to contribute towards education through the digital access opportunities that I set out in my answer earlier to Mr. Halcombe Johnson.
So just to confirm, you're saying that if a teacher is off with coronavirus, you're still expecting them to teach from home?
I didn't say that. I said some teachers may be able to contribute to teaching because they are self-isolating. They may be perfectly well, was what I said. And if they are perfectly well but self-isolating, they may be able to contribute towards the ongoing delivery of education.
Which leads me nicely into the discussion around contingency plans. Clearly, blended learning was the government's plan A up until the point that it changed its mind, and I welcome the decision to fully reopen schools, which we're now seeing, and thank everyone involved for making that happen. However, it is clear that blended learning as a contingency is still a very real possibility for many if the direction of travel continues. I appreciate in previous answers the Cabinet Secretary will say that those are decisions for individual schools and local authorities, but can I ask, do you have an oversight of what these blended learning plans look like? Because they were highly criticised at the time, with some local authorities looking at offering as low as 1 to 2 days per week in-class learning. Do you have an idea of what those contingency plans look like, and are you happy with them?
The first point I'd make is that the circumstances around the resumption of full-time schooling are a product of the significant progress that was made within the country in reducing the prevalence of coronavirus. And I think that's an experience and an accomplishment by the population in Scotland that we should warmly welcome, because that has enabled the resumption of full-time schooling in a fashion that certainly in April or May would have been inconceivable given the prevalence of coronavirus in our community. So that's a source of substantial encouragement. Now, the government's strategy in relation to the handling of the pandemic is focused unreservedly on trying to maintain that position. And that is and ministers are very clear about the fact that one of our fundamental objectives in our coronavirus strategy is to protect the reopening of our schools and the delivery of full-time education, because all of the educational advice indicates to us that that is the most advantageous position for children and young people. So the wider measures that we take, for which we are often criticised about applying other restrictions in other walks of life, have at their centre the determination to protect the reopening of schools. And I make no apology for that to the committee this morning. In relation to blended learning, Mr Green is correct. There may be a requirement for us to utilise blended learning, and that may be at an individual level. There may be individuals who have to self-isolate, and they must be supported in their education, and fundamentally that will be a responsibility of individual schools to enable that to be the case. And indeed there are classes and individuals around the country today who are self-isolating, who will be who should be getting that support to enable them to be in place. One of the requirements that I asked Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Education to undertake was to review the plans that individual local authorities had brought forward. That's an ongoing dialogue with local authorities to ensure that we have appropriate and adequate educational support in place should education be disrupted in the fashion that all of us want to try to avoid.
Thank you. Can we move to Ms Wishart before by Ms Mackay?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Consortium arrangements have been impacted by the new rules on classroom working. So can you indicate how many of those arrangements were in place, and if removing the option would impact on remote and rural schools more?
I think in answering this question, I think it's important to distinguish between the physical arrangements around consortia arrangements, i.e. the moving of different pupils around different school arrangements. These have undoubtedly been restricted as a consequence of COVID for quite understandable public health reasons, because we are trying in all circumstances to minimise the circulation of individuals between school buildings and school situations. There are, however, opportunities for consortia arrangements to be sustained through the work that is undertaken in terms of access to digital learning. So the ability to deliver that learning around a number of schools is really at the heart of the eSchool model, with which Ms Wishart will be very familiar from the presence that it has within her own constituency. So in that sense, I don't think there's any particular disadvantage that rural schools or remote schools will experience, because they will be, I would venture, habitually more involved in the delivery of that style of consortia arrangements, rather than the movement from one school to another to provide learning opportunities. There will be another aspect of the consortia arrangements which are slightly constrained, and that's around the ability of young people of school age who will still be school pupils undertaking some of their learning within colleges, where we are having to apply the regulations that are in place around the college infrastructure, which may well inhibit some of the arrangements which Ms Wishart might describe as consortia arrangements, where young people spend some of their time in school and some of their time in college, which will be a more challenging situation.
Thank you for that answer. That's your last response has actually answered the second question I was going to ask about the college implications. So thank you. That's my question for now.
Thank you. Just before we move on to our next theme, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the Columba 1400 project in your opening statement, and obviously that's a project, like many of the outdoor learning experiences, residential based. Can you explain how the money will be used to ensure that that leadership training continues?
Essentially, Convener, that will be undertaken on a remote basis, using digital technology to reach the Columba 1400 candidates, and then also to provide mentoring support to school leaders who have been involved in the Columba 1400 programme. So there's a range of different ways in which we can sustain the really impactful contribution of Columba 1400 without having to require the residential arrangements, which for the same reasons as the outdoor education arrangements are not practical to take forward in the current context, will also affect Columba 1400 on an ongoing basis. But crucially, this is one of the fundamental elements of leadership support that we're putting in place to assist and to strengthen the delivery of effective leadership, which I recognise to be critical in the period that we're currently facing.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We'll now move on to the theme of additional support needs. I'm going to have Rona Mackay, followed by Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to ask you what impact you feel COVID-19 is likely to have in taking forward the recommendations of the Support for Learning report. You said in your opening statement you hoped it could be published in the autumn, and we're coming into that now. So I'm just wondering, is that still on track?
Convener, we published the report from Angela Morgan in June, and I'm very, very keen to make sure that the recommendations and the actions that Angela Morgan suggests are taken forward in a substantial way by the government and our local authority partners. So I would want to assure the committee that I attach very high significance to this particular point. Undoubtedly, arrangements have been, implementation arrangements have been slowed up as a consequence of COVID, but I am working actively to minimise that, to ensure that we can have swift agreement around how we take forward the recommendations put forward by Angela Morgan and can move to enhance the delivery of additional support needs education to young people.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's encouraging. Angela Morgan's review said in part of it, additional support for learning is fragmented. Last week, Jennifer King, the ADES network chair for additional support needs, was a bit unclear when I asked her about how consistent the picture was throughout Scotland. Can you maybe expand a wee bit on that, and what oversight's been made and in all areas in Scotland, and how will that be coordinated?
I would have to accept, Convener, that inevitably there will be a degree of variation across the country in the delivery of additional support needs education, but I would also have to accept that there is variation around the country in the delivery of education as a whole. And that's in the nature of the decisions that Scotland has taken for many years about the delivery of education, which is fundamentally a decentralised model of delivery. And as the committee will be familiar, I very much favour empowering schools to enable schools to determine what is most appropriate and relevant to the interests and the well-being of children and young people within their own situation and circumstance. And that, of course, varies between different natures or different areas of the country geographically. There's a world of a difference between the area that Rona Mackay represents and the area that Beatrice Wishart represents, fundamentally different in their character. But what is the common theme between those very diverse areas is that we must ensure that the needs of every individual child are being met. And that is the fundamental anchor point of the government's policy in meeting the needs of young people with additional support needs. And it's the fundamental point in the review that Angela Morgan undertook for us. And so although there is not a uniform position across the country, I would want to be assured, and I know that schools and directors of education are focused on this point as well, on making sure that the needs of individual young people are met as effectively as they can be.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Dr Allen?
Again, on some of the same themes, I wonder if we could say more about the planned review of coordinated support plans and whether it will take into account some of the views expressed by parents. I'm sure you're familiar with about the ease of access to those and the implementation of those by local authorities.
I do recognise, Convener, that this is a significant issue. It's one that's raised with me regularly in my dialogue with representatives of the parental community, and it's important that the point I made in my answer to Rona Mackay is followed up assiduously within a school setting, whereby there is good dialogue between parents and schools about the provision that is in place to meet the needs of young people. I accept that in some of these circumstances, those discussions can be quite difficult for everybody involved because there may be differences of view about what is appropriate in certain circumstances. But fundamentally, if we start from the principle that the objective of those discussions is to ensure that the needs of every young person are being fully and adequately met by the education system, then I think we take forward an approach which can best meet the needs of individual children and young people. And good dialogue with parents around the whole concept of agreeing a coordinated support plan where that is relevant is important in that process.
And related to that, but perhaps more generally, looking at the report, the additional support needs review report in January 2019, one of the most interesting comments in it is that it believes that the achievements and successes of children and young people with additional support needs must be celebrated in equivalence to attainment and exam results. And I just wondered if you had any comments on what can be done nationally to ensure that becomes more of a reality.
I think this question gets into the heart of what we actually acknowledge and recognise as achievements within our education system, because there is a strengthening record of achievement by young people with additional support needs in our education system in terms of the awards that they are able to achieve within our system. A lot of our discussion focuses inevitably on National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. There are many other awards that are achieved by young people in general within Scottish society, but there are many awards that are achieved by young people with additional support needs, with a strengthened capability of achievement by those young people. So I think the debate has got to, and it's a point that I spend a good amount of my time trying to encourage, there is a debate to be had about recognising much more holistically the achievements that have been made by young people, rather than just judging the achievements of young people based on the narrow definition of very specific national qualifications. However important they are, it is recognised that there are opportunities for young people to thrive, and many of them do so in overcoming some of the challenges that they face. And that is, to quote the words of Dr. Allen, something that we should celebrate.
Thank you. We now move to the theme of the 2021 exam diet, and I would invite Ross Greer to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned in your opening remarks the unprecedented situation we're in with this coming year's exams, which is markedly different to where we were with earlier this year, and the decision that had to be made. There's simply no way to guarantee that the exams can take place, regardless of what changes are made to timetable. I appreciate the efforts that are being made there. So you've acknowledged, the SQ have acknowledged, that a contingency plan is required. There's a lot of concern from teachers that their workload will spiral out of control if they're having to prepare for 2 scenarios all year, and add to that the potential stress for pupils of spending the year ultimately not knowing how they're going to be graded and assessed. Are you able to give any indication now and any reassurance to teachers? Will their workload increase as a result of a twin track approach being taken throughout the year of exams and a contingency plan?
I would want to, at all possible costs, avoid that situation happening, of there being increased workload as a consequence of the situation we face, because in a sense, the answering of this question goes back to where we started this conversation about the resumption of full-time schooling. It is a challenging environment in our schools today. There are many, many demands that schools are having to address and deal with in the context of educating within a pandemic. So workload is under significant pressure already, and the issues with which I am wrestling, the solutions to those issues, I want to take forward in a fashion that does not in any way add to the workload of the teaching profession in that process. So those considerations weigh very heavily in the discussions that I'm taking forward through the Education Recovery Group, with the SQA, with local authorities, with the professional associations, and with other partners.
Thank you.
If I could perhaps also just add, forgive me, I should also have said, Mr. Greer asked if I was in a position to say anything now on that question. I'm not in a position just now to say anything definitive, but I do want to be in a position to be definitive before the October break, to provide that clarity to members of the teaching profession and to pupils.
Thanks, and I appreciate that there's both the consultation responses to the SQA process and Professor Priestley's report, but the logic of the argument that you've set out around the uncertainty, the fundamental inability to guarantee that exams take place, to me should lead to the conclusion that what's being talked about as a contingency plan, a non-exam model, should in fact simply just be the plan, so that if it's good enough to be the contingency, it should be now the default. Teachers and young people can go throughout the year with some level of certainty about how they're going to be graded. And I appreciate that careful consideration needs to be given as to exactly what kind of continuous assessment model or whatever similar approach that may be. But surely the only logical conclusion of the argument you've just laid out is that exams are too big of a risk, and we can debate and discuss and carefully consider what alternative there should be, but the risk is just unacceptable of even attempting, even thinking about going throughout the year and then getting to the end of it and finding that exams aren't possible.
Kavira, although there are similarities in the situation that we face for 2021 with 2020, there are also very striking and significant differences. In 2020, we had, essentially 48 hours notice that the schools were going to close, closely followed by the fact that it became impractical for us to enable teachers to gather evidence to support the estimation process, because quite literally teachers were prevented from accessing school buildings where much of the evidence lay. So we're not in that situation this year. We're some months away from the exam diet, which the current plan presumes will take place in late April and in May. So we have the opportunity to reflect on the issues that Mr. Greer raises on this important question. I think we also have the opportunity to reflect on the conclusions of Professor Priestley's work, which will be delivered to me by the end of the month, and also the extensive feedback there has been to the consultation exercise by the SQA. So I would assure the committee that these issues are all being considered. There is a very significant issue which I have to consider, which is about the volume of risk, because none of us can foresee just how much disruption to education there will be at an individual level, a class level, a school level, or even a local authority level within the country between now and the start of the proposed exam diet in April of next year. Nor can we be certain that in April and May it will be possible for us to undertake the examination process that we would normally and habitually undertake. So as a practical example, there will be some schools in the country which for certain subjects and qualifications, over 200 young people will need to be accommodated in an exam setting to be able to undertake that exam. And the largest number of individuals that we can have in a school hall environment, physically distanced, is probably about 50. So there are some practical and logistical issues that have to be wrestled with to enable the safe, fair delivery of the exam diet to individual young people. So these are the questions that I just want to take some time to think through with the Education Recovery Group to make sure that we have considered all possible contingencies, because we have time to consider contingency arrangements, notwithstanding the important points that Mr. Greer highlights of recognising that teacher workload, we need to make sure that we don't add anything to teacher workload in the process of wrestling with this dilemma.
Can we move to Mr. Gibson to be followed by Mr. Gray?
Yeah, thanks very much. I would just like to disagree completely with Ross Greer, who clearly is in favour of abolishing exams and moving to a continuous assessment system. Is it not the case that exams are crucial to narrowing the attainment gap, given the fact that many parents assist their children and also are able to afford tutors to assist with ongoing assessment, whereas an exam actually allows children a greater opportunity to shine as individuals without their parents helping them to complete their homework, or indeed tutors actually helping them along the way.
There's a debate, convener, that I think could occupy, well, it's occupied the education system for many, many years, and the education system around the world, about what is the most appropriate method of assessment of the achievements of young people. And it's one of the questions that I think we can look forward to consideration of in the review that is undertaken of curriculum for excellence and methods of assessment that we've invited the OECD to undertake, and which will report in June of 2021, because there will be very strongly held views held by people who believe in an exam methodology for undertaking assessment, and those who believe in a more holistic continuous assessment based model. And these issues are played out regularly within educational debate. So I think that obviously the approach that's been favoured in Scotland for as long as I can remember has been an exam-based model. Indeed, there has been some debate about qualification involving this committee around questions as to whether exams should be added, for example, to the National 4 qualification, which currently does not have an exit exam, for many of the reasons that Mr. Gibson has marshalled in his question. So there's a substantive educational debate to be undertaken, but what I have to be mindful of is I must be able to be certain that qualifications will have appropriate standing to enable young people to make the next stages in their learning journey, and also that the qualifications that are achieved properly assess the learning and teaching that has been undertaken, because that is the fundamental point. Young people must have undertaken the learning and teaching that is implicit in any particular qualification.
Thank you. And prior to the reversal of downgrading, was there a wide variance in awards between schools and subjects relative to previous years, or was there a consistent pattern? And with regard to your answer, what would you put that down to?
The data that the SQA has published broadly shows that teacher estimates normally in relation to SQA qualifications are accurate on about 50% of occasions. And then the remainder are either over or underestimated. What I put that down to, I think, is the necessity of ensuring the understanding of standards is appreciated broadly throughout the education system. And the SQA did some very good work through the SQA Academy work that was undertaken in extremis earlier on this year to assist teachers in strengthening the ability to undertake estimation work. And indeed, there is a lot of expertise that has been developed within the SQA over many, many years in relation to the understanding of standards and the moderation of standards by SQA appointees, who of course are teachers. These are teachers in our classrooms today who do extra and specific tasks in essentially moderating and examining the work that individual young people have undertaken. So I think if we are to rely on teacher estimates, we have to work with the profession to ensure that there is a deep understanding of standards and an ability to apply that to the work that is undertaken across the country on a consistent basis.
Okay, thank you. And given the increase in grades subsequently awarded, there's been another 2,000 to 3,000 increase in the number of university places. So some young people who would not previously have been able to go to university because their grades wouldn't have been high enough will now go. What concerns do you have about the ability of people on the margins, young people on the margins, to cope with university life? Do you have any concerns about potentially an increase in the dropout rate? And if so, what support is being given to young people and indeed the universities themselves to minimise the dropout rate and help people through their first year of university?
The first thing to say, Convener, is that there will be an increase in the number of students from Scotland going to university as a consequence of the awarding process, and I think that's welcome, and that will broaden the range of young people that are able to go to university and to have that experience. The second point I would make is that when I discussed the steps I was going to take in relation to the awarding based on teacher estimates, one of the key issues that was raised with me by university principals was the importance of addressing exactly the point that Mr. Gibson has raised with me. And they were wholly committed to making sure that that was the case. They recognised that that some young people would perhaps face greater challenges in adapting to university life as a consequence. And indeed, of course, adapting to university life will be very different this year because of the context in which universities are returning to their activity this year. So I would assure Mr. Gibson that this point is understood very clearly by university principals. They expressed to me their wholehearted commitment to making sure that these young people were warmly welcomed into the institutions and supported to enable them to fulfil their potential in a university context. And that will be a subject of ongoing discussion between myself and Richard Lockhead, the Higher Education Minister, with universities and colleges throughout the country.
Thank you. And if I may, finally.
So, sorry, Mr Gibson, I've cut off other members beforehand. I will bring you in at the end if we have time, but I'm going to move to Mr Gray, to be followed by Mr Green.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you'll have seen the evidence provided to the committee by Dr Kirk of Glasgow University, who's an expert in children's rights. Dr Kirk says this: it is important to note that the whole SQA system is not human rights compliant, therefore breaches the legal obligations SQA and the Scottish Government has under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This breach in legal obligations occurred when the right to appeal was removed. Since this time, there's been an erosion of the abilities of young people to appeal through their schools. That's quite a damning indictment. It applies not just to what happened this year, but to the system which was already in place pre-pandemic. And I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would care to address this, but also to explain to us how he can assure the committee that when he does reach a conclusion about arrangements going forward, that they will indeed be human rights compliant.
The government attaches the highest importance to ensuring that all of our measures are undertaken on a basis that is compliant with our obligations in terms of human rights, and indeed, as the committee will be familiar, we are moving to legislate to incorporate the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law during this parliamentary year. So we attach the greatest significance to these questions. I am familiar with the points that are raised by Dr Kirk, and indeed I've discussed the issues in relation to the SQA appeals with the young people who articulate on this question, the SQA Where's Our Say organisation and grouping. And obviously we are keen to address any issues that emerge out of those discussions as part of the work that we undertake. I think it's vital that in the appeals process that we bring forward, and it is exercised at any given time, and is that there's the appropriate opportunities for young people to have their say, but to be able to draw on the appropriate evidence to support any appeal challenge of that type. And we've taken the view that that is most effectively undertaken when young people can act in partnership with their schools in advancing the appeals that they put forward. But I will, of course, give further consideration to the issues that are raised by Dr Kirk, particularly in the context of the determination of the government to ensure that all of our measures are human rights compliant.
Well, I mean, I think it's good that the Cabinet Secretary has discussed these concerns with the young people who work with Dr Kirk, but I would just gently point out to him that he clearly hasn't convinced them that in fact enough importance has been attached to making the SQA's procedures human rights compliant. And one particular group of young people who I think feel their rights have been abrogated this year are those young people and their parents often who believe that the school assessment of their award was incorrect and have been completely unable to appeal since the sole route of appeal is by the examination centre, i.e. the school, which in these circumstances the young people are appealing against. What would the Cabinet Secretary say to those young people?
I think we've faced uniquely difficult circumstance in 2020 where with very short notice we have had to put in place a means of certificating the achievements of young people, and the only possible approach that we could base that on would be on the estimates of work undertaken by teachers. Now that assessment made by teachers was encouraged to be undertaken based on the evidence that teachers would be aware of the performance of young people. Now, I acknowledge that accessing some of that evidence would have been a challenge for teachers given the restrictions that were in place in the spring, which I think makes the situation ever more difficult. But I think so we've had to adapt to a circumstance which is particularly unique and particularly challenging in this context. And when I go to my answer to Mr. Greer, I am anxious to avoid circumstances in which we might face any of those difficulties in the period going forward. So the measures that we take are designed in all circumstances to try to take the broadest assessment of the performance of young people in these circumstances, to ensure that those estimates are well informed by teachers, and to enable young people to be assessed on that basis. But there are, of course, opportunities within the appeals system for young people who believe that they have been the subject, for example, of some form of discrimination in the award that has been suggested by their teacher, to have that considered by the SQA. So there are routes available under the current context to enable that to be considered as an appeal by the SQA.
But for those young people who believe that they've been assessed incorrectly or unfairly, not as a result of discrimination in the way that you've described, there was in fact no route to appeal their award. And I'm asking what you have to say to them.
What I would say is that there were routes available to young people in given circumstances.
No, not to these young people. If they feel they were simply incorrectly assessed, or no account, for example, was taken of illness at the time of sitting a prelim, there was no route for them.
Well, of course, if a case can be put together that assesses some form of prejudice or disadvantage or discrimination that was experienced by a young person, then that can be the subject of appeal. And that opportunity has been available to young people as a consequence of the opportunities for appeal that have been put in place by the SQA in these very, very difficult circumstances.
I think the Cabinet Secretary needs to examine the arrangements that he's had in place, because that is not the case.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Mr. Green, to be followed by Ms. Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Just following on from this line of discussion, by the end of May, teachers had submitted around 500,000 grade estimates. Cabinet Secretary, you held a meeting with the SQA on the 12th of June where this was discussed, and it was clearly identified there was a large amount of divergence between the SQA data and the teacher estimates. Now, this committee had previously received evidence where witnesses had appealed that if that situation were to occur, their ask of the SQA was that they should engage with teachers and schools if such divergence arose. In the minutes of that meeting that you held that I got from an FOI, the SQA said that they were unlikely to engage in such a discussion because of resource cost. Can you enlighten us what this resource cost limitation was on why the SQA did not engage with schools and teachers on this divergence, and was that a mistake?
I think what the evidence that the SQA has given to the committee would show is that the resource issue at stake was the ability of the SQA to properly and fairly engage with the number of centres that would be involved in such an exercise. So what the SQA felt would be an almost impossible task to undertake, whilst respecting fairness to all learners, was to engage in that dialogue on the scale that it would have been required at that particular time, and then to enable it to have been able to be done in a fashion that would not have in any way disrupted the ability to determine the awards that were being undertaken. So I think that's the explanation of the resource questions that the SQA were raising on that occasion.
You, in fairness, was that an error of judgment on their part? Because the way to deal with that surely is not to engage with nobody. There was clear evidence that had they engaged in schools, with schools where there was a large divergence of opinion between estimates and SQA data, then the levels of moderation which had to be implemented could have been avoided. There's a clear assumption there. And I guess as we're looking ahead to next year, and if teachers are required to give estimates again, how can they be certain that that level of blanket moderation and lack of engagement that they saw this year won't be repeated?
In my earlier answer, I made clear to Mr. Green that the scale of the exercise was what made the SQA judge that it would be difficult to provide assurance on the fairness to all learners, and because fundamentally that then adds an element of further subjectivity into the discussions about grades, which may not be available to all learners in all circumstances, which therefore creates the difficulty of assuring the system of fairness to all candidates and to all learners. So that's the difficulty that has to be overcome. And I don't really think there is any evidence that Mr. Green can marshal that demonstrates a contrary point of view in that respect. Now, as we look forward, there is obviously, and as my answers to Mr. Greer, I've made clear that we are looking at contingency issues, and in my answer to Mr. Gibson, I made clear that we have to rely upon the strength and the quality of teacher estimates in certain circumstances, and that we have to make sure those teacher estimates are as robust as they possibly can be, and that there is professional support to enable teachers to undertake those estimates. And all of these issues are part of the consideration that is being given to what approaches we might take in the period going forward.
Can I bring in Ms. Wishart to be followed by Alec Neil?
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, it's been reported from a meeting last week with the National Parent Forum that you had indicated the SQA have consulted on what steps they could take to reduce the burden of assessments before the exam diet of 2021 and what elements could be removed. I wonder if you could give more detail on that, please.
I'm not in a position today, Convener, to give more detail on that. Obviously, the SQA has undertaken a consultation exercise which has attracted a tremendous amount of feedback. I have to say that feedback is not universal or unanimous. There's a lot of different views expressed within that, which is invariably the position within any aspect of education policy. And in my opening remarks, I indicated that because of the work that we are undertaking with the SQA and the Education Recovery Group to look at contingency arrangements around the exam diet in 2021, I've asked the Chief Examiner to hold back on publishing the response to the consultation that the SQA has undertaken. So that's at my request. The SQA is not publishing that material to enable us before the October break to provide clarity and certainty about any changes that are made to the exam diet in 2021 in essentially one publication, so that the system has got that clarity available to it at the earliest possible opportunity. And I appreciate that the system would like that clarity in early course, and I understand that entirely, and I provide the assurance that it will be available to the system before the October break.
Thank you for that answer. obviously, reducing coursework could be a risk, and there's been some concern expressed about that. And there would also be a ripple effect on any coursework in coming years with higher and advanced higher. So is that being included in the assessments that are going forward with the SQA?
Convener, in my response to Mr Gibson, I made reference to the debate that rolls on in education about the most appropriate method of assessment between to what extent we should rely upon a final examination, to what extent we should be relying upon coursework or continuous assessment. And that's a very live debate about where any education system should properly construct its balance. Those issues are integral to the discussion that we take forward about what evidence should be utilised to assess the performance of a young person. To what extent should it all be dependent on an exam? To what extent is that appropriate? Now, we'll reflect on some of those questions in relation to the approach to the exam diet in 2021, but they will also be the subject of discussion by the OECD in their review on a longer term set of questions about how this issue should be taken forward within Scottish education. And obviously, I appreciate there's a range of different views that exist on these questions, and we have to make sure that's reflected in our deliberations.
Can we move to Mr Neil to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson?
Thank you, Convener. Thank you. In your introductory remarks, John, you referred quite rightly to the and I know you've allocated from some of the £135 million laid aside some money specifically for catch-up, and you also mentioned the fact, quite rightly, that some pupils will take longer to catch up than others. But since we're talking about the exams or whatever assessment system is used next year, clearly to maximise the chances of every pupil, we need to make sure as far as possible that they have caught up on what they lost during the lockdown earlier this year. So can I ask you, what are the plans for ensuring that at the appropriate and earliest opportunity that pupils have caught up on what they've lost this year, so that we maximise their chances of good results next year?
Convener, fundamentally, this work will be taken forward by individual schools to make sure that young people are able to be supported to reach their full potential and to have the opportunity to undertake all of the learning and teaching that is required to enable them to perform well in an examination context or an assessment context. Some of those issues are relevant then to the amount of time that's available for learning and teaching. One of the options, for example, that the SQA consulted upon was the possibility of a delay to the timetable for the exams. So instead of starting, for example, in mid-April, the exams could start later, thereby providing more opportunities for learning and teaching to accomplish exactly the task that Mr Neil has referred to. So that's one option that the SQA have put forward and are considering. So what my objective in the course of this year, working with local authorities, is to maximise the available time for learning and teaching, given the fact that for some young people in different stages and circumstances, they will have lost some time in the earlier part of this year. The other element which we are bringing into this the whole situation is the provision of additional learning opportunities through the eSchool, which is a proposition which originates in the Western Isles, but is now essentially a mainstream platform that's available and accessible to all learners in all parts of Scotland. And there is a joint venture being taken forward by eSchool, Education Scotland and Directors of Education working through the Regional Improvement Collaboratives, for example, where we're drawing together learning that's being undertaken in schools, lessons that are being recorded and made available for young people to access through the eSchool network. And the eSchool network can actually provide live lessons into the bargain. There's also additional study sessions out of hours that eSchool is providing, which are available in the early evening. They run for about 45 minutes at, I think, at 5, 6 and 7 o'clock at night. They're available to young people to log into from wherever they want around the country. And I've been seeing really excellent levels of uptake and participation in these sessions, which are designed to reinforce learning and to address exactly the point that Mr. Neil is raising. There's a very wide range of subjects that are now available at National 5 and at Higher, and we're working to constantly recruit more and more teachers to record lessons to be part of all of this work, to make sure that there is essentially an additional facility that can reinforce the learning of young people and address the point that Mr. Neil has raised.
And can I ask, of the 135 million, I know it's been, some of it's for other things, like £80 million for the additional teachers, which will obviously help with the catch up. But is within that 135 million, is there a specific amount specifically for catch up initiatives, John?
There will be some of the resources that are allocated for additional staffing, which is designed to address the issues on catch-up learning. There is also going to be, I suspect there'll be a resource that will be allocated there to support the expansion of the eSchool venture, which will assist us in broadening the availability of that support. But that's, that is what that we're constantly looking at to make sure we have in place all of the arrangements that will enable us to address the point that's been made.
And my final question on a slightly separate subject, the appeals for this year had to be into the SQA by the 7th of September. Have we any indication yet from the SQA, the number of appeals, the kind of main issues that were raised, any patterns in the appeals that have been lodged, or is it too early to say?
I don't yet have any information on the pattern of appeals that have been submitted.
Thank you. Can we now move to, sorry.
I'm happy to update the committee.
That was a happy to update the committee. Sorry, I'm speaking over the Cabinet Secretary. Can we move to Jamie Halcrow-Johnson to be followed by Alistair Allen?
Thanks very much. Fiona Robertson of the SQA gave evidence, came before this committee to talk about the results. She said, "I do not think that we will be able to compare this year's results with previous year's results or future results in the same way, because the basis on which awards have been made is different." Do you agree with that, Cabinet Secretary? And what concerns do you have over the potential consequences of that?
I think that's an entirely reasonable and understandable position from the Chief Examiner, and I agree with it. This was a very different model of assessment. And I don't have concerns about the point, because I think everybody acknowledges that we are operating in 2020 in a very unique set of circumstances where there has been significant damage done to the well-being of young people, and the decisions that we took were commensurate with addressing those particular issues.
Thanks very much for that. Just on another point, Richard Lockhead, the Minister, came before us and spoke about funding of university and college places. He said one person's definition of the full cost of that might be different from another person's in relation to the cost of these additional, the funding that the Scottish Government was providing for the additional places that might be result of the, as a result of the return to the grades. So could you tell us what the funding costs will be? Are you looking to fund the full teaching cost, or will funding in the additional university places be done on the basis of the existing funding model?
We've indicated to universities that the government will fully fund these places, and obviously the detailed arrangements around that are taken forward by the Scottish Funding Council, who operate at arm's length from the government on these questions.
Fully funded in terms of the full cost to those universities, or in line with the Scottish Government's existing funding model?
I'm not sure I understand the distinction that Mr Halcrow-Johnson is making. Obviously, the Funding Council takes forward these judgments based on the government's commitment to fully fund the additional places that are being allocated.
Okay.
Thank you. I think Dr Allen's question's been answered, so I'm going to move to a couple of supplementaries. First from Kenneth Gibson and then from Ross Greer.
Yes, thanks very much. Some years ago, a constituent came to see me because her daughter had been refused a place at medical school. The young woman met every single criteria except one, and one I wasn't even aware of, and that criteria was that her parents had no education. So even though she herself had done exceptionally well at school and had worked as a volunteer for the NHS, etc., she was refused a place because her parents had not an O grade between them. I lobbied the then Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell about this, and he intervened. The young woman was given a place at medical school and she subsequently graduated 7th in her year. But the reason I'm raising this is I just want to ask whether or not this kind of glass ceiling, whereby parental education is considered by at least some medical schools, if not in a broader way across our university system, has now been completely eliminated from Scottish education, so that young people and others who apply for university places can be judged on their own individual merit.
Convener, I would be very surprised if such an approach was taken by any of our universities or medical schools, and indeed I think the work that's been undertaken by the government in partnership with our university colleagues in pursuing the widening access agenda has resulted in very significant increases in young people whose background in the past would have been an obstacle to them entering higher and further education, has in fact been overturned, and I expect more achievements in that respect in relation to the entrance that is made into the university system in 2020.
Thank you for that reassurance.
Thank you. Can I remind members, we're now moving into supplementarity because there's still 2 topics to cover in full. So we'll have very quick supplementaries from Ross Greer and then Jamie Green.
Thank you, Convener. Returning to this year's courses, Cabinet Secretary, I've had a number of teachers get in touch with me for more practical subjects, things like drama, but particularly home economics, a couple of weeks ago, who were reporting really inconsistent approaches across the country, and in many cases teachers were unable to perform practical lessons with their pupils, which in a subject like home economics obviously presents huge barriers. This was explained to them as being because national guidance from Education Scotland that was subject specific in these areas had not yet been published. What this was essentially creating was a postcode lottery. In some schools, teachers were able to conduct practical lessons, but in most they couldn't because the guidance wasn't yet available. That was about a fortnight ago, so 3 weeks had been lost since the start of term. Could you confirm if subject-specific guidance has now been published for all subjects, and if not, what the timescale for it is?
There has been subject-specific guidance published for a number of subjects, but not for all. But I expect the issues to be complete on that probably within the next week to 10 days, I think would be a reasonable estimate of that.
Useful, thank you.
Mr Green to be followed by Mr Gray.
Thank you. It's a very niche but a very important question, Cabinet Secretary. I've had a lot of emails from people regarding their communication with the Student Awards Agency Scotland, SAS. Many dozens, if not hundreds of people are experiencing extreme difficulties in contacting them and getting answers. And most people seem to be resorting to Facebook to trying to get any sort of communication with them. Reading some of the comments on their Facebook page, it's quite horrendous. the lack of communication they're getting. Can I just flag this with you in your department to take this up with some senior folk at SAS, that they either need more resource or more ability to deal with queries. This is an absolutely critical and vital time for those students and parents who are desperately trying to contact them.
I'll certainly explore that issue, Convener.
On to a new topic with Ms Mackay.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. You've referred once or twice quite reasonably, I think, to the funding that's been made available for additional teachers. But in the evidence to the committee, the EIS describe this funding as insufficient to make a meaningful difference. They point out there are still a large number of recently qualified teachers with no posts or who've been put into supply pools to backfill future vacancies. And they point out that it is still the case that Scottish schools have amongst the largest average class size in the OECD, which means, as they say, that without an increase in teacher numbers, the high pupil density in our schools means they will be more vulnerable to COVID-19 outbreaks relative to other OECD countries. So it's clearly not a happy situation. So can you explain two things? Firstly, these additional posts, will they be permanent posts into the future to address this systemic problem of large class sizes? And secondly, what further things will you do to be able to provide sufficient new teachers?
Convener, if I could just add some detail to my last answer to Mr Greer. The guidance on home economics is now available, and the guidance on music and drama will be available by the end of this week. And of course, the guidance on physical education has been available for a couple of weeks. In relation to Mr Gray's points, obviously the maintenance of a safe schooling environment is absolutely critical in the period going forward. A safe environment for staff and for pupils. And I believe schools and local authorities have worked incredibly hard within the guidance that we have available to enable that to be the case. Obviously, we have supplemented the availability of teaching personnel by the levels that I've set out today, and I'm pleased that that recruitment has been undertaken. I can't give a definitive answer about every single contractual situation that a local authority will have entered into. I don't write the contracts for these staff, but I see no reason why the staff, given the degree of turnover there is within the teaching profession, for those individuals not to be offered permanent posts. And obviously, we have put in place significantly increased resources to support the delivery of education through the £135 million that is available for education recovery, 80 million of which has been allocated for staff. And we're working with local authorities to make sure that that is utilised to the full to enhance the delivery of education in Scotland.
We're going to move to the theme of counselling and wellbeing, that the committee returned to our work on that last week. And I'd like to invite Ms Mackay, and then we will move to Mr Johnson.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, we know that young people have been through a terrible time this year with missing school and then having to go back to school in restricted circumstances. Can I ask maybe for an update on whether the goal of counselling services will be available to all secondary school pupils and primary ASN school pupils aged 10 and over? Will that be universal, and will it be met by the end of next month?
Yes, the commitment will be met by the end of next month, at the end of October. Almost all local authorities have fulfilled that commitment already, but there are a few whose recruitment processes were interrupted and delayed by COVID. But our expectation is that that commitment will be fulfilled by the end of October.
Thank you. That's excellent news. Can I also ask how that policy will be evaluated in terms of its impact on young people's mental health at a national level? Is that going to be an ongoing process?
There's a series of reporting streams that are in place between local authorities and the government on the implementation of this commitment, and then also some work to identify the impact on the well-being of young people who have utilised these services. So that will be a source of ongoing dialogue as part of the wider work that is undertaken, which involves a whole range of different interventions to support the mental health and well-being of children and young people. Not all of it will be a compartmentalised assessment of the impact of this particular commitment. Some of it will be looking at the wider range of assessment that's undertaken on the work that's undertaken across government to support young people.
Just finally, will there be an oversight to make sure that the money allocated for that purpose is spent on counselling? And you know, can you maybe explain how the funding allocations were agreed?
There is a reporting structure in place, Convener, that accounts for the distribution of those resources on an annual basis. The distribution of the resources were agreed with local authorities. We put particular weighting into the formula to address issues of rurality, given the fact that we wanted to make sure there was coverage of all areas of the country, to make sure that all young people in every part of the country had access to such support, and there was weighting put in to address that particular requirement for remote and rural areas, and that was agreed to the satisfaction of local authorities. And there will be reporting on the performance of delivery against those budgeted amounts.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Can we move to Mr Johnson?
Thank you, Convener. And Convener, forgive me, because I originally wanted to ask a question about college funding, and I'll write to the Cabinet Secretary about that. But I actually want to return to the question of rights and children's rights in particular, because I think there are some issues that I think we need to re-examine. So there are two clear principles in my mind regarding children's rights and education. First of all is that they are assessed and judged on their own merits, and I think that's a point that Kenneth Gibson, I think, very usefully highlighted. But secondly, that they're empowered to make their own decisions, and that is integral to any processes that we have in education. But if we look at the appeals process that we have in place, that even if we look at the answer that the Cabinet Secretary has already given, where those young people feel that there is evidence that was not taken into consideration or circumstances that were not taken into consideration, they required the consent of their schools for those appeals to be put forward. There is clearly an issue for schools in doing so, because they would have to admit or acknowledge that somehow their assessment, their estimation process was incomplete. So you can understand why they may not want to do that. But the young people could only submit an appeal if the schools agreed to it. Does the Cabinet Secretary not recognise that there is an issue in terms of rights when that is the case for young people in those circumstances?
I think, Convener, it's important to recognise that any decision-making process on the question of an appeal is going to have to be determined by the availability of evidence to support such an undertaking, because that will affect the ability in any circumstance to be able to determine a different position that is arrived at. And the marshalling of that evidence is fundamentally an integral part of the educational experience of every child and young person. So I think it's quite difficult to conceive of an evidence base that can be provided that is not linked to the work that is undertaken within a school by a young person and informed by the professional judgment of of teachers. So I think those factors need to be considered in assessing the points that Mr. Johnson puts to me about the way in which such appeals can be taken forward and the context within which they can be considered, because there is such an inextricable link between the gathering of that evidence within the school context and the contribution that can be made through the professional judgment of teachers.
Forgive me, Cabinet Secretary, but that's a different question. The admissibility of an appeal on the basis of evidence, I grant you, absolutely, it is, any appeals process, there will be the grounds upon which an appeal will be made. But the question here is whose decision it ultimately is regarding whether you proceed with an appeal. Now, does you not concede that ultimately, that as the circumstances are right now, that decision is ultimately the schools rather than candidates? And surely it is for the SQA to determine whether or not the evidence provided is sufficient grounds for an appeal, whether that appeal is submitted by the school or by the child. But that's a different question to the decision itself as to whether to proceed with the application for an appeal.
I think it's difficult to determine entirely the answer to that question, given the fact that we are dealing with a uniquely different set of circumstances in 2020 in the way in which the results were ultimately determined, because we had no alternative but to determine the results based on teacher estimates. So that essentially became the foundation of the assessment system that we undertook. And the ability to, we looked to the teaching profession to consider the evidence that would be available to inform such judgments. So I think it's difficult to determine a different position based on the experience that we've had in 2020. Having said that, there are, of course, issues that we have to be mindful of and attentive to in the judgments that are arrived at about individual appeals and any other given circumstances where young people feel that they have not had a fair and appropriate assessment of their contribution. Now, I set out earlier, there are, of course, routes by which young people were able to pursue appeals should they feel that they were entitled to do so. But it's difficult to, I think there's a wider set of issues that we need to consider in any assessment of the appeals approach in any given year. But my point about this year is that we found ourselves in very different circumstances because of the exclusive reliance we had to have on the estimates that were made by teachers in the absence of any other available evidence.
I think I would just politely submit that when it comes to children's rights, it's about principles rather than circumstances, but I'll leave my questions there.
Yeah, very final question, Cabinet Secretary, from Ms Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Will the Cabinet Secretary ask the OECD to publish an interim report before the Holyrood elections next May?
We've obviously had to extend the timetable available to the OECD for the carrying out of the review that we have asked them to undertake. I would remind the committee that we have not only expanded the remit to look at the wider issues in relation to both the broad general education and the senior phase and the articulation between the two, but we've also had to acknowledge the constraints within which they're operating due to the effect of the pandemic. Now, the work on the engagement around the OECD review is commencing imminently, and there will be extensive dialogue with the education system. Whether that enables the OECD to formulate any interim thoughts in advance of the 2021 elections will be an issue for the OECD to determine. I'm very happy to discuss that with them. But what I'm certain the OECD will want to make sure is that whatever they say and whatever they conclude will be based on their interaction with the Scottish education system to provide the strongest foundation for the analysis that they put forward.
Secretary, call the session with the Cabinet Secretary an end and thank Mr Swinney for his attendance as always at committee this morning. We will now be moving into private session and remind members to be back on Microsoft Teams at 12 o'clock to conclude today's session. Thank you.